everyone, and welcome to the Arise Exchange. It's Thursday, the 26th of June. We're live to you from Abuja, Transcorp Event Center, the venue of the 2025 annual meetings of the African Export-Import Bank. Welcome to the show. Of course, the conversation today, a whole lot around the $3.4 trillion trade potential of Africa. How do we unlock that? That's the key conversation we're having right now today, and of course a couple of sessions and thematic speech on the surroundings. But first, let's get some of my guests to speak to this very important point. Welcome my first guest on the show tonight, and that's Queen Ehi-Uujamhan. She's the Group Chief Financial Officer at Norenberger. Good evening, madam.
Good evening, sir.
Thank you. It's good to have you.
It's a pleasure as well.
I'm sure the $3.4 trillion, I'm sure you want to have a share of that at Norenberger. So you wouldn't mind bringing some of that to the table. But again, that's it. How do we fast-track trade as a vehicle for economic growth for Africa? Let's start from there.
All right, that's a very brilliant question in my opinion. And we all talk about trade, and that's not a new topic, right? So for me, I think trade is a catalyst for economic development in Africa. And, there's been so many talks on how do we ensure, materialization of trade in Africa. So for me, I view it in twofold because I personally think we've not been able to materialize or see the impact of trade. And I think that's due to the fact that complementary efforts from both the public, the government and the private sector needs to be harnessed. And what do I mean by this, if you ask, right? So I don't think trade has been optimized because of the deficit in infrastructure. So from a government perspective, I believe governments within the African region need to start looking inward in terms of ensuring those enabling factors for trade to be available. So when we talk about infrastructure, we're talking about the roads, the ports and energy, so you talk about trade and how do they manufacture these goods for trade. So if you don't have the very conducive, resources and requirements for economic development like infrastructure, those sort of things hamper trade. And I think for me, from a private sector speak, right, we look at trade using Nigeria as case study. We look at Ghana, for instance, we have cocoa in Ghana, but it ends up in Switzerland as chocolates, right? So how do we look into the value chain and look at those areas that would maximize value for us?
So talking about cocoa as agro-allied,
yes.
Are there other critical sectors in Africa that you think can help us to fast-track trade? What are your thoughts on that at Norenberger?
Also, for us at Norenberger, it's a group of companies. So we have the asset management company and we have the infrastructure bank. Right, so in terms of trade, the infrastructure bank is posed to ensuring, we fund infrastructure-led projects, that sort of have that ripple effect in Africa. So we're very open to collaborations with multilaterals, African countries, and even within the Nigerian ecosystem to facilitate.
Yeah, so you need to deepen domestic capital mobilization. It talks about, at this conference, at this annual meeting, it's about how to make Africa's capital work for Africa. Mm-hmm. So, how do you see that happen?
Oh, that's a very, again, interesting question because, I think for us in Africa, we need to be true to ourselves, right? Most countries in Africa have this very high exposure in terms of, sovereign debts, right? So that's limiting in a sense. So I think we have to get to that point where we're realistic to ourselves and say, what are the ways of financing? Because if we're depending on the multilaterals or external debts, for long-term strategy, that's not very viable. So looking inwards, what are the options for us in Africa? So personally, I would say we need to look at how do we mobilize domestic funds, and the sectors that comes to mind will be, the pensions, the insurance. These are sectors that are, very rich in terms of funding, right? But when we look at those sectors today, the sort of placement of funds or the use of funds at their disposition are still almost, basic investments sitting with government securities.
So you're talking about innovative tools?
Precisely.
So what about tools do you think?
So I believe we need to be creative right now, innovation, right? We need to be looking at how do we develop projects and instruments, that those institutions can tap into and facilitate trade. So again, those are very regulated institutions. So the government side of things needs to sort of support, right? Nobody's asking for reckless use of those funds, but internally build those capacities that allows access to those funds.
Very interesting. I'm sure the conversation is ongoing, and that's one of the reasons why Noren is here and with boots on the ground to support this initiative. Thank you so much, Queen Ehi-Uujamhan, the Group Financial Officer at Noren Financial Services Group operating in Nigeria.